I'd like to start off our discussion by asking maybe Jonathan to start. Could you please tell us the status of the work on the low emission development strategy? What can we expect? What will be the main feature of this strategy?
So thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. I'm quite excited about the level of enthusiasm reflected in a room of this size. I think it suggests an engagement in the long term that is commensurate with the scale of the problem. And in that sense, I think our mid-century strategy work is one contribution to that discussion. I think many of us are aware that the extent of the efforts we've undertaken in the context of our nationally determined contributions, when added up, will not meet the long-term goals that we've set for ourselves under the Paris Agreement. And as a consequence, there's a need to think further about what we would do next. How do we think about the next generation of those efforts? How do we think about the kinds of technologies, the kinds of research we might want to focus on, the kinds of policy development that might be prioritized to indicate where we would move after the first round? Now, these, of course, take two different frameworks. In one direction, what you want to do is say, where are you today? What has been done with the policies that you've got? And as you project forward, assuming you weren't to change those because they have impacts well beyond the time that you've set, what would happen? What's the emissions trajectory? And then you can say, well, supposing I were to iterate on those, supposing I were to add incremental change to those, what would that look like in 2030 or 2040 or 2050 by the mid-century? And the other direction is to start as a global exercise and to say, where do I want to be? I want to be at least at 2 degrees, and I want to strive for 1.5. And what does that mean in terms of trajectories and scenarios that we might set for ourselves to look at that longer term? Those converge in some places. Some areas you can see you really have to decarbonize the energy system, pretty much to zero. You've got to find ways to manage your transport sector so there are no emissions in the transport sector. You've got to think about what you might do in the land use sector so that you continue to see net negative consequences, because some other parts will be rather difficult. Some of the non-CO2 gas emissions will be rather hard to contain, and you need to have some room in those sectors, and therefore you may need even net negative emissions from things like land use. So you begin that process, and then you think, what are the policy implications of those items? How do you frame those, and what do those mean for the near-term actions that you have to take? That's what work we are currently doing. We will be releasing our own strategy later this week. I invite you all to come to hear some of the details on it. But where we stand in this exercise is in an effort to do exactly that. To develop not the answer, but a series of options, a series of scenarios of framing for how the answer could be derived. And we, with our colleagues, are hopeful that this exercise, by moving it forward rapidly, by taking this next step immediately, will help form the basis for a global discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I'd like to, just in starting, highlight the work of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network on the Decarbonization Pathways Project. And in particular, the Canadian team who helped work on that will be part of the next panel discussion. As Jonathan noted, the Paris Agreement commitment to a 2-degree solution with ambition to 1.5 degrees is critical, and in Canada's ratification of this agreement demonstrates our support for that and the decarbonization we need by mid-century. We see the opportunity in working concurrently on our short and longer term objectives, so our 2030 target and 2050 ambition, to help both integrate in terms of long-term planning our climate change and low carbon growth objectives. As has been introduced, we have committed to release our strategy by the end of 2016 and intend to do so this week. I'm just going to highlight a couple features in it and then speak to some of the pathways that are there. As I noted, the concurrent development of our detailed NDC plan, which we're doing jointly with provinces and territories and Indigenous peoples in Canada, coupled with the development of the mid-century strategy, gives us that opportunity to think of the actions we need to take now to help set us up for the long term. Secondly, I think a critical area of that is looking at some of the long-term investments in infrastructure, and I'll speak more to that in the second question, in terms of both their benefits in establishing those low-carbon pathways, be it for transportation and mitigation, but as well in terms of enabling the growth. I'll also note the importance of carbon pricing, which we're introducing now. It already covers 80% of the Canadian economy, and the Government of Canada is committed, working with the provinces and territories, to have it Canada-wide by 2018, to send that market signal and drive the innovation and the incentive to help put us on that medium-term and long-term pathway. CO2 removal is going to be absolutely key looking at the mid-century. And examples I just came from a carbon capture and use and storage form, such as biomass energy with CCS, is key to thinking about opportunities for even negative CO2 emissions. We view the importance of all sectors acting, but looking at different pathways across regions in our country. I'll just highlight 6 areas very briefly of focus. One is non-emitting electricity generation, building on our over 80% non-emitting start. Broad electrification of end-use applications, transportations and buildings, as well as industry. Low-carbon fuels, including renewable natural gas and synthetic fuels. Strong focus on energy conservation and efficiency. In fact, the IEA suggests that we need to get to 40% reductions for the 2% pathway. Sequestration of forests and lands, and a focus on short-term climate pollutants.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Rodolfo, what's the situation in Mexico? I think we have to hold the microphones close to our mouth because the acoustic otherwise doesn't carry so well.
Thank you. I put some slides just to show you the challenge that we are facing, that Jonathan explained it very well. And there are some figures here. The next slide, please. The next one. Well, you will see that in our emission inventory, Mexico is emitting more or less 700 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and we are capturing, balancing these emissions with sequestration in our forests for almost 173 million tons. So the Paris Agreement set a goal to balance after the year 2050 our emissions, and it is not feasible to do it only with forest CO2 capture. We need to add industrial processes in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere if we really want to avoid this 1.5 degrees scenario. So in the next slide you will see that our commitment in the Paris Agreement is to peak our emissions, to decarbonize our economy in different sectors in 2026. But in the next slide, you will see some of the mid-century scenarios that we are addressing in our strategy that we'll present in the next few days. 2 days? Yes. And you will see that it is necessary to increase our ambition in the NDC, because the NDC path for Mexico need a peak in 2035 that could be very aggressive if we don't take early actions in a set of sectors, but also a set of pollutants, or including or engaging other participants in the efforts that we are doing as a country. Yes, we need to engage non-state partners, we need to engage the private sector, and we need to really work on the whole spectrum, of climate forces, because if we only reduce CO2, methane, perhaps some of the F-gases, we will not reach these goals of the Paris Agreement. We need to also add short-lived pollutants and many other pollutants, especially criteria pollutants that are also affecting climate change.
Thank you. Well, this is some remarkable work happening in an incredibly short space of time, so thank you already for that. I hear a lot of questions about the value of low emission, of long-term strategies. At an age when politics is, this political cycle is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter term focused, when there is, of course, a lot of uncertainty about technologies, it's really hard to foresee what the world may look like in 2050. So I was just wondering, Stephen, if we can start with you, if you could just explain the use and the benefits that you see and that you experience in your work in government and with other stakeholders in these long-term strategies, and also if you might elucidate a little bit on how they might help you also achieve other policy objectives beyond, of course, the very important objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. I do agree it's absolutely essential to think in the longer-term context here and set the course for the low-carbon economy and help drive longer-term planning and investment. I'm going to focus on 3 areas of benefit in responding to the questions. The first is, as I noted before, looking in the long term and thinking about the short-term decisions in the pathway to 2030. That long-term exercise does help inform those pathways. For example, the investment decisions and the regulatory framework for clean electricity, as an example, which is going to be critical for the deep decarbonization looking out to the mid-century. It also helps to avoid stranded assets by setting the signals now for those pathways in the longer term, and helps avoid future costs. And then finally, it does provide the longer view through the specific regulatory measures in the short term with an eye on the longer term to provide those signals to business. Secondly, and I think related to one of the other critical policy objectives, certainly for Canada, but I think shared by governments around the world, is supporting long-term low-carbon growth. By providing that longer-term pathways and facilitating that broader discussion within countries, it does help drive decision-making on infrastructure, clearly with governments as a key partner, but attracting private sector capital as well. And this is one area where Canada has recently announced the creation of a Canadian infrastructure bank, for example, to help enable a focus on clean electricity from generation to transmission, storage, and smart grid utilization. And third, focus on research and development, critical to identify the areas where we need technological improvement or breakthrough development, for example, in the area of the use of carbon in products and applications, help drive down costs, again, provide that certainty and enabling business opportunities, export opportunities, and an opportunity to work collectively with other countries, for example, through mission innovation. So just to conclude, I'd say this exercise is critically important to do in a frame that is involves consultation and engagement to help look at those longer-term investment, innovation, and growth pathways.
Thank you, Rodolfo.
Well, first I have to say that in Mexico we have a goal that is a mandatory goal because according with the climate change Mexican law, we need to reduce our emissions by 50%, taking the reference of the year 2000. So, in order to reach that goal, carbon pricing is a bit of signal because we have this regulation. And the first thing that we made was the carbon tax. But carbon tax is a universal carbon tax for fossil fuels. We are reducing subsidies in fossil fuels, but we need more economic and financial signals in Mexico. The first that we are trying to build is the carbon market. Carbon market linked with the new clean electricity market that is created through the energy reform that President Peña Nieto made just at the beginning of this administration. So the way we are trying to stimulate the private sector to reduce their emissions, but especially as you saw in the slides before, in the oil and gas sector and in the transportation activities, is through new mechanisms that establish a pathway of innovation or a roadmap for innovation and the introduction of new technologies, low carbon technologies.
Wonderful.
So thanks very much. It's hard to follow two other speakers who more or less covered the ground that I would have taken, but let me take a somewhat different approach from the one that they did and break this up into three domains. The first one is what you do with public dollars at the governmental level, at the national governmental level. And here's a question then of where your investment might go. Governments tend to invest in R&D, governments invest in long-term policy. That's distinct perhaps from what you might see in the private sector. The private sector is looking for signals, market directions, where that might take you in the medium to long term. Investments that might turn over in a few years versus investments that might not turn over for decades, long-lived capital stock like the power plants or the built infrastructure. And the third is a direction of much more local action. What happens in cities? What happens in communities? For each one of these, there's an enormous value in having a long-term strategy. What it does is it sends signals of where you want to go. And they're a little bit different in each case. And I want to start at the other end now and look at what communities get. Because for too many people, the idea that you will have to reduce emissions in any given sector very sharply is really hard to imagine. And one of the things you get from a deep decarbonization structure is how you can get there. And frankly, how little different that society might actually be than today's. You can still get around, you have mobility, you still have energy, you can turn your lights on, you can still cool your systems and run your factories and have opportunities for growth. And the scenarios provide you with that vision in a tangible way that moves you out of the realm of the impossible into the realm of what you can deliver and do. With respect to local governments, it begins to think about planning. If you're thinking about a planning horizon where you're going to look, for example, at a renewable energy portfolio and it requires setting aside and zoning land for where you're going to put your wind turbines, where your solar system's going to live, how you think about efficiency gains and local quality for your new retrofits in your buildings, those are often local. Where is that going to go? Well, here's some guidance on that front. And at the federal and national level, it begins to shape a policy direction. What are the stranded assets, as Stephen has mentioned? How do you think about the things that you probably shouldn't invest in? Because in the long term, those are going to be retired, and you're probably going to have to retire them even maybe more quickly. That's not an effective use of government policy or government dollars. These plans help identify and define those trajectories. So we see this kind of a dynamic, this kind of a development as a really substantive and important way to go to develop these kinds of visions.
Wonderful. What you three have just done is you've basically given us a roadmap for the next 2.5 days of discussion. Because we'll be talking here this afternoon about innovation. How do we get the technologies underway that these long-term strategies show we need? We'll be talking a lot about different industry sectors. What are the signals that we need in buildings, in transports, in other industrial sectors? And we'll be talking a lot about infrastructure. How do we make sure that the infrastructure that we build, put in the ground today is smart? So I think this is a wonderful illustration of why we need those strategies. In the next panel, we'll be hearing more about what these strategies look like and how feasible this actually is. It's hard, difficult, but feasible. I want to just ask you one final question. I'll ask you to be brief because we're running out of time. The three countries have agreed to pursue this together. Of course, every country develops its own low-emission development strategy, but you've agreed to do this together as a group of three countries. I wanted to hear why. And I wanted to ask if you could shed some light on lessons learned and to what extent your cooperation might be a useful model also for other regions to think about, because you're of course not the only countries looking at low emission strategies, but you are certainly in the vanguard. Rodolfo, if I may start with you, and if I could just ask you to limit your remarks to 2 minutes perhaps.
Yes, well, first because our countries have an integration process, especially in the energy sector, but mainly in the human sector, because we speak Spanish, you know, we have common goals, you know, and there's a big challenge in the energy sector for this infrastructure integration. And if we will produce cars in Mexico to deliver cars to the United States and Canada, we need to do it well, we need to produce green cars or low carbon cars. If we produce electricity in the Mexican side, we need to deliver to the United States, as Canada is doing, low carbon electricity. if we will market goods, we need to market low carbon goods, no appliances or many other things that we are trading. So that's the main reason, because we have a deeply integration process that you cannot stop with walls. You need to build bridges, no? Instead of having.
So thank you very much. I would just maybe only add one thing to what Rodolfo has said, and that is that none of us possess the answer to this question. We are all looking collectively, and all of you in the room and all of us at this conference are looking for how we can radically reduce our emissions and maintain and grow our economies. And we in the US don't have the answer. We are looking to our neighbors in Canada and in Mexico to help us define that answer. We're actively looking at others that are beginning to do the same kind of work. And a number of countries are in fact in the process of developing those long-term strategies. We know what we have to do. We know the level of reductions we have to achieve. There are an enormous number of possible pathways. Some will be economically efficient and lead to significant growth. Some could be mistakes, and we want to avoid those. And we are looking with our partners and our colleagues, and in the context of North America, where there is this deep integration, it's essential for us to work together, but we're integrated as a world. And we're going to need to think about this expanding well beyond the continent into a global effort to take the value and the learnings to each other.
Thanks. Perhaps just a couple final comments. One, I think each of us has looked at a pathways focus and not policy prescriptive mid-century strategies. These will need, in a sense, to stay evergreen as technology evolves and as our thinking evolves, but clearly provide that kind of longer-term framework for that conversation. Second, there is deep and long-standing cooperation between our governments, from science to the area of harmonizing regulations, to focusing on trade and enabling our integrated economies. I think it's also important to note that that integration and connection also occurs at the subnational government level, which is key, including in the area of carbon markets and between cities and other private sector partners. The final point I'll note is just the learnings from this exercise, I think, are going to be critical to share globally, and we will look for an opportunity as we release and advance our strategies to have fora here and through time to share those learnings.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And I think this distinction between a technology pathway and the shorter term policies, I think will come out quite clearly when we discuss NDC implementation over the next coming days. And I think what this panel has shown is how these long-term pathways provide a framework, a longer-term framework within which then to address the shorter-term policy questions. We don't have time for questions and answers, I'm afraid, from the panel, but I would like to give the floor briefly to Jeffrey Sachs, who'd like to just make some additional remarks.
I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, for working together on this, because I think that's really a great step. Obviously, the United States can import hydropower from Canada and can import a lot of Sonora sunshine from Mexico in solar energy, and so there are really some great opportunities for synergies here. I just wanted to ask and make sure that the Keystone Pipeline has no place in this three-nation scenario. Maybe you could confirm that. It cannot be the game of energy producers that they say we go low but we export the fossil fuels to the rest of the world. So this has to be part of the scenario also. And I would just wonder if Dr. Lucas would confirm that that horrible project is gone forever.
I'm not going to comment on that specifically. But I think the critical message we have been stressing both at home and I think through the work on these strategies is looking at how strong commitment to environmental protection and addressing climate change, getting on the track to meet our NDC commitments and the deep decarbonization needed by mid-century, and growing the economy and supporting that transition to a low-carbon economy is a critical hand-in-hand relationship that we're working on.
I appreciate it, but I do want to stress that we have a lot of energy producers like Australia, Canada, the United States that have the dream of decarbonizing their own economies and then making a living off of selling coal or oil sands and so forth to the rest of the world. We should not be drug pushers of fossil fuels to the rest of the world. So I just want to convey that, because if it's not clear, this will not be well received. This is really important that we get this right. Thank you.
So please join me in thanking this panel, not just for the wonderful presentation, but more importantly for the really important work that you're doing.